So welcome to a very intimate panel. Thank you for being here. The topic for this 1 hour conversation is the future of work from the point of view of the governments, the businesses, and the citizens. I must admit, I would have started with citizens first in that enumeration, but we always seem to put citizens last as an afterthought to some extent. I have a very interesting panel to moderate today, and I'm particularly happy that it's very, very gender balanced. And I'm usually not that lucky in the panels I'm moderating. We have with us Claire Casey, who's Global Director of Public Policy with the Economist Intelligence Unit. So I'm just going to start with the ladies. We have Henry Olsen, who's a Washington Post columnist. And we have Florian, who's a manager with Kearney. Therefore, we cover all topics in the enumeration of the title of our panel. So I'm going to start with Henry. From your point of view, what are the key elements regarding the future of work now? What should we put on the table and then dissect?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. It's my first trip to Bucharest and Romania, and I'm looking forward to learning more about your country as I stay here. I think thing we should do is talking about the fourth industrial revolution is to think about what characterized the first, because that'll help us understand what's changing and why it's creating such huge social problems in most of the developed world. And when I think about what happened in the first industrial revolution, what was distinctive was, for the first time in human history, we gave men machines that rather than rely on tools to produce wealth, which relied on human or animal energy. We gave men machines to operate, which meant that they could create more, faster, and over a longer time span than ever before. And what's happening now is three things that is upending that the world that we created. First, we're creating machines that can only be accessed with people of certain intelligence. So think about the people who use software or code or use financial programming. The average person of average intelligence can't use that machine very effectively. That's why you have to have college degrees, and they tend to be the sort of professions that you have to have an IQ of 110 or 120, well above average, in order to access. That creates a social problem because the fastest wealth creating entity is increasingly being commanded by a small minority of the people. The second thing we're doing is creating machines that need little or no operation. So think about the first industrial revolution. What made people move from farm to factory and gave them wealth and a stake in society for the first time was that they weren't the owners, but they were the operators of something that created immense wealth. But when a machine doesn't require any person, then there's no sharing of that wealth with that person. If you have a robot in an automotive factory which is essentially operating with very little human interaction, or the prospect of driverless cars or trucks, that'll put millions of people whose value is driving these machines out of work. That means that just as wealth is concentrating in the higher intelligence quotient, fewer opportunities to obtain wealth are being afforded to people of average or less intelligence. And that's creating in the United States and in other countries unemployment, underemployment, loss of income, and social unrest. And then we have this feature of globalization, which is for the machines that remain that can be operated by average intelligence people. People in the West are increasingly shipping them out to other countries, which is a boom for Romania or China or Bangladesh as people make the move from farm to factory that the West made 200 years ago. But again, it removes opportunities for people to get decently remunerative jobs with average or less intelligence. And so what we're seeing is the predictable aftermath of that citizens in that affected class are angry and lashing out either against scapegoats like immigrants or against the structures that help facilitate these developments. And the people who are benefiting massively, in other words, all of us in the audience, are resisting that change. And I think if we adapt, what we have to do is, again, look at how we handled the first industrial revolution that created demands for political democracy and a social welfare state that ensured that people had dignity and a stake in growth. The current social welfare state is based on the idea that private sector remunerative work will be available throughout society to people of all talents. That's not going to be true if we continue with this, or it's going to be much less true. And I think a social safety net that does more to involve the government more in the, not planning of wealth creation, but in the distribution of the wealth that is created so that the jobs that remain in developed countries are more remunerative and more dignity producing, just as we did in the first industrial revolution. That's the positive development going forward. But the longer we resist that, the more the pressures build up and the more the possibility of a huge negative development, which is a reaction of people who are a majority or near majority in society who say, slow it down or stop it, comes up. And I think it's really imperative we get it right now while we have the time to make the shift to keep our generally prosperous and stable societies strong.
Just as a follow-up question, you have mentioned the idea of intelligence, which would be something that's innate to a person. Should we add to this conversation, and it has been put on the table in the previous panel, the idea of education and access to education? Because we might have people that are innately intelligent, but however, they have not been exposed to technology, to the type of courses that would reskill them or provide them with that. So how do you see in this respect the role of education, and education from early ages, education for people that are already in the workforce, and so on?
I think that's one of the key things that we need to work on. We need to be much more involved in creating educational opportunities for people after they turn 18 or after their young adult years, so that they have access to technical skills. I think we need to continue to have a strong emphasis on identifying people from all economic backgrounds and social backgrounds, so that those who have native intelligence are provided the opportunity to find their way in a society and use that. But I still think that at some point you're going to run up against the natural limitations of the human being itself, is that we can do this, but if we're not creating, those of us in the room are not creating a society where we find remunerative uses at a Western level of development for people with an IQ of 90 or 95. And they're not much below average, and there are many, many, substantial portion of that. Then any amount of education we provide is going to be less limited, less able to adapt to that, because we're already cutting out the opportunities for them that education that they can handle would be able to take advantage of, which is why I think it is an important part of the development, but to put too much faith in that is, in fact, overlooking one of the major problems we have, which is that we are increasingly in the developed world not providing remunerative opportunities for people who are not of above average intelligence.
The issue regarding the involvement in education, particularly by companies that are drivers of this digital transformation, is on the table. And UiPath has been mentioned in the previous panel, and it's usually mentioned for the past 2 years or so in Romania all over the place. And UiPath, through its RPA, is one of the leaders of a change that will put 300 million people out of a job in the next 10 years or so. That's why the company got involved in upskilling, in providing courses, in trying to shift this. And it's clear that the pressure of education cannot be solely put on governments, as it was, but also on companies. So that would be the intro to Florian, who is the company in the panel. And I know that you have an overall input from many companies' points of view. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, as a consultant, I obviously will have some slides. So until the colleagues put up the slides, what I would like to say, what I will talk about. So Kearney has what is called the Global Business Policy Council. It's a think tank comprised of the most senior partners in the firm and senior executives all over the world, tackling challenges and opportunities at a global level and thinking similar to how Aspen does it. What do we do in the future? What are the risks? How do we change? How do we make better for the humanity, for the environment, and so on? We did a survey this year, and we do it every year, with around 450 most senior executives from the biggest companies in the world into how they see for the next 5 years the challenges and the opportunities in the context of Industry 4.0 and globalization and geopolitical stress and so on. But before I go to the results, I'm glad we talked about change, and that the Industry 4.0, it is a big change because effectively compared to the other 3 industrial revolutions, it's not only machine and physical and robots, it's actually the ubiquitous connection between the machines and human beings and data, and it obviously will change a lot. So I'm going to start with a metaphor actually on change, if it works. So sometimes change is easy. And that picture depicts what happened when the anesthesia was discovered. When the anesthesia was discovered, it proliferated all over the world very fast in a couple of years for one simple reason. When doctors were doing surgery without anesthesia, what was happening? The person was screaming, he was cut on live, you had to have 4 or 5 other men just to hold him on the bench, yeah? So it proliferated very fast for one simple reason. It made the life of the doctor and of the patient very easy. And because it made it very easy, it spread fast. On the other hand, change indeed sometimes is not easy. When the antiseptical substances, ether and so on, were invented, they didn't get spread throughout the world so fast. For a few reasons. It didn't make the life of the doctor necessarily easy. It took time to understand the benefit, because those were times when if the wound was cut and it got infected, the infection was perceived as something good, something about the healing process, which is good. So it took a longer time to see the benefits, especially for the patients and for the doctors. So Industry 4.0 and the technological advancement, in a sense, it can bring opportunities, it can bring risks, but it's all about, if you think about it, it's all about this change, if it will simplify people's lives or not. And I think if it will not simplify people's lives, it won't, all the futuristic scenarios that people talk about will be far-fetched from happening. And that being said, I'm going to skip about what Industry 4.0 is. Henry explained it very well. And I'm going to go to to show you a couple of results. So 450 senior executives from all over the world, very good representation in terms of countries, in terms of regions, in terms of industries, all CEO, CXO level, including non-executive board members. The main outcomes. The number one operational environment opportunity that companies see throughout the world is a successful technology adoption. Yeah? And more than 50% of the executives see in the entire technology space, in the entire Industry 4.0 space, the number one opportunity as being the artificial intelligence and machine learning. Industry 4.0 is much more than that, obviously. It's about virtual reality, wearables, 3D printing, advanced materials, biotechnology, neuroscience. It's about a lot of advanced science fields, but the biggest opportunity the executives see is in the artificial intelligence and machine learning. And there are always heated debates whether artificial intelligence and robots will actually displace workforce. And there's so many studies, they're gonna displace 40% of today's workforce until 2030, and so on. So we asked the executives, how do you see for the next 5 years your workforce evolving? And 91% of them, and these are executives from all over the world, 91% of executives, they actually don't see workforce decreasing over the next 5 years. In fact, 50% of them expect the workforce will increase. And that's for a couple of reasons if you think about it. First of all, the artificial intelligence and machine learning, to really use it and have a good business use case, to have results out of it, you need people to implement it. You need people to use it. And artificial intelligence, if you talk about advanced things, neural networks and unsupervised learning is all cool, but even the very basic things like supervised learning, like a simple segmentation model, like a simple econometric model, which is still machine learning, it's a predictive model, and it has existed for 50, 60 years. It's still not widespread and adopted simply because it's a very technical field, and people need, executives and companies and business needs people to understand what those machines or robots or AI tools do and how they do it, to be able to interpret the data. And that brings me to one of the biggest challenges that executives this year in the C-suite survey see for the next 5 years, which is talent management. And 80% of executives are already seeing it as the biggest challenge to technology adoption, and majority of them are already investing more in attracting talent and retaining talent. And what is interesting is that, and I encourage you, by the way, I'm not going to go through all the slides, obviously, but I encourage you to download the white paper from the Aspen website, from the conference website, because it has all these results like detailed, yeah? What's interesting is that executives somehow focus a bit more on attracting talents because they don't have it yet, or they perceive they don't have it, and actually less on retaining it. It's actually 10 percentage points lower focus on retaining than on attracting. The only industry which is different is obviously the IT, because there it's not sufficient only to attract the people, but it's becoming more and more important to retain them. Yeah? Because demand is bigger than supply. And as a final thought about the interesting outcomes of this year's study, I'm actually going to show what executives think about likelihood of different events. And we didn't ask only about these 5 events. They had a number of 20 or 30 events to see which ones do they think are more likely to happen over the next 5 years. And the number one event or trend that global executives see is that more and more consumers will prefer local, sustainable, and personalized services, which comes to an extent to a bit of paradigm compared to globalization and everything becoming global and you can buy everything from all over the world. Actually, more and more consumers prefer local, sustainable products, and of course, personalized products. Another likelihood, another very likely event, and that's seen as the top external environment challenge, is that the regulatory restrictions will intensify on what means cross-border trade and digital trade. And you see it today, right? You see it with US and China trade wars. You see it with different trade arrangements between not anymore global scale level, but more local, yeah, in Asia, in US with Canada and Mexico, in African countries. And that's driven partly because, and I think it's going to happen, is driven partly because with the proliferation of technology and of data, at some point, you don't have enough regulations today to how that data sits where. Data localization regulations, illicit financing regulations, and then it becomes harder and harder for executives or for the people to think around a global scale when every, let's say, region or market has different approach. Yeah, you have more countries now putting digital walls to what happens with the data. You have more markets putting physical or digital walls to what happens to their products.
So
another
building on that.
Sorry.
No, because
I can talk for
but I'm pretty sure we can all talk for hours on the subject. But I see the third line over there, which is the business executives that will increase their role in tackling societal challenges. And Henry raised the topic of a societal challenge that creates a lot of conflict to some extent, because we have two types of sort of delivery of information. We have delivery of information or education, if you wish, for competence, like being able to use a tool that others have developed. And we have education for comprehension, like being able to create that tool. And that's not a topic that's now on the table. It has been for hundreds of years. So we have an endeavor, which is the SDG. We have other topics on the business market, such as should we pay people for the data that put forward? How should we tackle that? And I would also add to the conversation, Claire, with the SDG angle, and then to continue with other aspects, because it's obvious that executives acknowledge this issue, that governments acknowledge this issue. So what's the next step? What do we do with it?
So I wanted to take a slightly different tack with this conversation because it usually focuses in on North America, Western Europe, and what's going to happen to workers in those economies. But there's actually a really big discussion to have around our society's economic development, human welfare, and how these technologies could potentially impact that. I'm actually not a big believer in these gloom and doom scenarios. I think there's a lot you can do. Technological change happens within a context. It happens within policy context. It happens within a societal context. And in every major period of rapid innovation, there have been dystopian predictions about what the future would look like. And it's never worked out that way. It's always been a mix of good and bad. And we see that today, right? Algorithms can help us figure out disease prevention strategies. They also can spread disinformation in elections. Each one of these technologies can be a double-edged sword. So the EIU, we do a lot of work in foresight, trying to help organizations and companies and governments figure out these mega trends and how they might impact their mission. And we looked at this question of economic development and societal growth and human welfare. And where we came at it was there are some real risks. There's a gender risk. We know that women have less access to STEM and IT training across societies. There are a few exceptions. One of the sort of bright lights is actually in the Middle East. If you go to the UAE, most of the students in the STEM programs are women because they know that that's a way that they can be judged fairly, or that's their perception as they're starting their careers. But broadly, there's a real gender list. We also know that algorithms have built-in prejudices in them, and so there is an issue there. There's a real risk of what is being called premature deindustrialization. So countries that have traditionally use low labor costs and export-driven manufacturing to drive their movement up from least developed to middle income are losing potentially that as a tool to develop their economies. And we don't have an easy answer to what could possibly replace that. So countries that are heavily dependent on things like the garment industry and that manufacturing. Also back office solutions, so countries like the Philippines and India that are doing a lot of back office work, processes, that can be automated, that can be AI. today. And so what are those countries going to do? And how do you adapt? And I think there's actually some really interesting and exciting stories. So if you take the perspective that we do have choices here, we can choose what this technological change will look like for us. And the goal is really to make the most of the upside and mitigate the risks of the downside. So what are the upsides? One thing we've seen so far is that unlike industrial development, there isn't a huge lag in the digital space. So with technologies like ride sharing, it's actually local providers who are quickly developing their dominant market share locally. The big players internationally are not entering markets and owning them. It's the local upstarts that are owning those markets. So that says that maybe this digital space is actually more promising and there are more opportunities. So what do countries need to do? They need to make sure that they have the physical IT infrastructure to have that become a thriving replacement, potentially, for the loss of export-driven manufacturing. And they need to make sure that they have the regulatory infrastructure, data privacy being a huge issue, but there are many. What do we do around education? How do we train the workforce of tomorrow? And that's a lifelong process, starting in primary education, going through STEM and ICT-focused secondary education, and then lifelong learning, because we don't want there to be a sort of lost generation in the workforce that are shut out of these opportunities far before retirement, but well after they ended their formal educations. And then looking out at where technology can unlock growth. And I think that's probably where I first came to these issues professionally years ago, is looking at that potential. And we see that in the very basics of financing mechanisms being unlocked, mobile finance in Africa. That's where it started. That's where the innovations were coming from, with least developed countries using your cell phone to bank. That was really, I thought it was a particularly exciting time about 10 years ago. But now we're seeing, and we talked a little about blockchain and not getting too far into it because it's such a complicated issue. But one of the things you can do with blockchain is register property, which in a lot of environments, there are not these formal registers. And that unlocks and enables people to leverage massive amounts of capital that's been sitting on the sidelines that can feed entrepreneurship. So I guess when I look at history, what the lesson I see is that bringing more people into the workforce, and I think we can view this in that way, has never been actually a long-term problem. So when women suddenly had technology to ease their household burdens, they entered the workforce in force, and we didn't have a problem with too many women. It actually was a driver of growth. I think we should put that hat on. There might be some very challenging dislocations, but there are also tremendous opportunities that we haven't even begun to seize.
Well, because you have mentioned the blockchain, not me. The idea behind it would be that we have two separate discourses. We have the, let's call techie discourse, that's highly technical, and that also goes into machine learning and AI. And so you have a layer of technology that's to some extent hard to comprehend at first light. And then you have the rest of the crowd that is aware of that technology, but is still in the competence thing. So I know how to use my phone and to get data on it and to browse the internet via it. But do I really need to comprehend the programming behind it in order to use it proficiently? Does society need me to comprehend it? And I'm using, like, you know, an easy example, but the blockchain goes into that. Do I need to know how machine learning, and I'm going to Florian on that, do I need to really understand the programming behind machine learning in order to do a report via some sort of solution that's provided by a company?
Well, I think there are different types of functions in an organization. So you obviously need some people that understand the machine learning, the algorithms, the technicalities behind, to be able to program it and do what the business people need them to do. but more and more you will need skills in the typical functions to interpret those results and be aware how to interpret those results. In a very simple example, you put in a company, and I've seen many times, you put an advanced machine learning model, to predict churn of the clients. And you use a very advanced one. I'm from different companies, I won't name it, and then it gives a result. How do you interpret it? How do you understand it? How do you rely on what a statistical software or an AI software tells you? And it's actually a bit more than just the technical skills. Actually, I have a slide for that. I'm a consultant. So we asked the executives what are the skills that they find very difficult to find in the market now, and what will be the skills that will be most important for the future, for the next 5 years. So obviously technical and technological skills are difficult to find now, and they'll become more and more important. But it's also a couple of other skills, which is the creativity and innovation skills. And I would add to that something which is called abductive reasoning, that no machine can do. Deductive reasoning means something like if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. Inductive reasoning is something more on the finding correlations and patterns between the data and cause and effect relationships. That's what AI and machine learning does. But abductive reasoning is something which has to do with, I look at the data, it tells me something, I have my own experience, I have my intuition, I have a vision. There's no mathematical relationship into, this is the context now, and this is where I want to go, but I go there. And this is how actually innovation appears, and companies and unicorns like UiPath and the Amazons and the Apple appear, because they have this leap of faith and deductive reasoning, and machines, at least today or for the next couple of years, they won't be able to replicate that. It's also about leadership and management skills, and critical thinking, problem-solving skills. Problem-solving is first and foremost. As a consultant, I can imagine it's not about having a tool or a formula to apply it and that's it. It's about a little bit more imagination, how you approach the problem from different angles. These are skills that if people find it hard today, and they will be more and more important in the future. So even more important, like Claire said, it's about a lifelong learning, but not only technical skills, it's more also these soft skills.
The question, and that would lead the way to Henry as well, is how do we make sure that people who have those skills are not considered first-grade citizens and people who are laggards in obtaining these skills due to various reasons? Innate characteristics, lack of education, lack of access, gender, or whatever. How do we make sure that we don't have first-rate citizens, second-rate citizens, and they are still in, all of them, in this, to use a very dear term to the Aspen crowd, social contract?
I think that's one of the key challenges in the developed world, is that we can see the increasing stratification in society, the increasing sense that we, the people who are active in obtaining and using those skills, are better than they. And we can see it in the way the political manifestations are being discussed, that the people who support a counter-reaction, generally they, are often described in terms that suggest that they're not considered to be average citizens or full citizens. And that's more reminiscent of pre-democratic societies than it is of the 20th century social contract society. And that, I think, means that just as people who understood what was going on adapted the language and the policies of the society to account for the desire for dignity by people who their ancestors would have considered serfs, or the people, and not meant in a good sense. That's exactly we need to rediscover that sense of human equality and human dignity that allows us to sacrifice some of our control and our wealth in order to provide what they desire and really need for human flourishing, which is the sense and the actuality of being equal citizens. That's the choice we make rather than one that happens organically.
And building on that, I turn to Claire, and with one line that I'm particularly fond of. The fact that if you would have asked me 20 years ago when I first saw Terminator which side I'm on, I would have said Sarah Connor all the way. 20 years later, it's kind of hard to acknowledge we are all Skynet. I mean, for real. We're working for companies that develop technology. We're here, praising companies that push technology forward. So
you like Schwarzenegger more?
Do I have to admit that in public? But that's pretty much it. And we, at least because we're here and we have this conversation, we have the critical thinking skills. So we acknowledge that there's an issue. We acknowledge that we need to change. How do we change? Is there some way out of turning into Skynet and making a more humane, more dignified Skynet?
Oh gosh, I don't think there's a choice between sort of opting out or opting in all the way. And I think this goes back to, I think technological change is inevitable and it is beautiful. It has delivered better lives for the majority of the population on this planet. And the question is, as societies, how do we choose to make the most of that technological change? How do we choose to use technology to empower people, to drive forth their potential, to allow for entrepreneurship and innovation? And I'm a hopeless optimist, perhaps, but we've just never seen in history things stop. There have always been new industries that emerge, and I think it's a sort of failure of imagination to think that that will not occur again. But that said, we need to think about what we want our societies to look like, what guardrails we want to put in place to ensure that people don't get completely left behind, to ensure there is an opportunity for productive opportunity and dignity for all members of our society. And I think that's a challenge. And it's not, I actually think the challenge is much more consistent between developed and developing countries. And in a way more challenging for developing countries because they will have not yet have achieved wealth when these forces will happen. And so we talk about the loss of social cohesion, but when you're thinking about a society which has not yet had labor movements engaged in collective bargaining and fundamentally transform the way politics are done, when you have not yet had the formation of a robust middle class, when you take out those key steps, there's going to have to be a different path charted. I don't have an easy answer for what that looks like, except for the fact that we need to be keenly aware that it's happening and putting sort of our best thinking around how to find alternative pathways when the one that so many societies have relied on to make that progress forward it is disappearing potentially. And then the flip side is that developed economies are dealing with a whole other side of this challenge. So it's going to be a complicated century for this and many other reasons. But it should be interesting.
To put a wrench into that as well. We have different actors charting the path. For hundreds of years, we had one key actor, which was the Leviathan, the ruler, the monarch, the country, the government, whatever. So you had one, but now we have that. We have supraregional entities, such as the European Union. We have companies, large behemoths of companies. We have citizens that choose to be outside the grid in some way, like pocket societies that would like to be in on the progress but not in on the current model. So you have different actors. How do you ensure cohesion in the creation of the path when you have so many cooks?
If that's for me again, well, I was pilloried last night for saying that we need a regulation. But I do think when you look at the fact that the 9 of the top 10 companies in the world are either financial services companies or tech companies, and are massive global entities that are operating in a fairly deregulated environment, that does create real challenges for governments. And in terms of charting the course for their countries. I think what's actually happened in the EU recently is really interesting in terms of going after anti-competitive behavior and in terms of moving forward aggressively on data privacy, because they're creating global standards, because this is, I think you said it, I've spent most of my career working with large companies, and the only thing they hate more than uncertainty is complexity. And I would say, and so reducing complexity. When a group like the European Union takes a stand on something like data privacy, it forces actually a global conversation about that issue. It forces a new regulatory level for the world, because you cannot you can't put a fence around Europe.
And to that, I would add that you refer to GDPR. It's e-privacy directive that's coming, which will be tougher than GDPR next year. But I think the problem and the complexity is given not only about the technology and what's happening as technology, it's also about talking about Industry 4.0. Think about the major economies like US and Germany, industrial economies, yeah? The Industry 4.0 view and future and approach is completely different. German economy and German view on Industry 4.0 is all about technological advancements, advancements in materials, in improving the manufacturing model, in improving the products. On the US view on the Industry 4.0 is actually more about new business models, how you do business, new digital products and services, platform economy, platform as a business model. That already brings a problem and a complexity in how do you regulate the use of technology. I'm not going to go in just as an example, you have data privacy, you have illicit financing, I said. Think about you mentioned a lot about workers. Think about labor rights. Think about the fact that today the gig economy, the freelancing economy, is already $4 trillion at the global level. But that's super problematic from the labor rights perspective, because if you're effectively a freelancer, you have no labor rights anymore and no labor protection. And that's also a complexity for the society that regulations and policies have not managed to solve until now. What do you do with people that all of a sudden start thinking with the technology and the work from home and from everywhere, you want to be a freelancer. But then what about labor rights? So I think it's also the difference between the different countries and economies.
What about labor rights? Because that's a huge topic for the future of work. I mean, we are talking data privacy and how people use it. But what about that? I mean, we can talk about unions, but can you have unions in a gig economy?
I'm not talking necessarily about unions. Labor rights means to ensure to people that it's not only work in life, it's also life. And the second industrial revolution, actually, that was the biggest success of the second industrial revolution, because you introduced the machines and the division of labor, but then you realize, wait a second, if I introduce the division of labor, and then if I can count what each person does on the production line, then I can, also think he can't work continuously. He needs a certain amount of time. And that was the introduction of 8 hours per day of work, 40 hours of work, 40 hours week of work. Think about with the spread of technology, and you're always online, and you're always emailing and phone calls and WhatsApping and Facebooking and whatever. You can't disconnect from work anymore. And you have two aspects here. You have the aspect of regulating that even tougher. And you see countries like France, which regulates and says, no emails outside of working hours. Yeah? And you get fined for that. And you also have the aspect which we haven't talked about too much, which is the generational aspect. And you have the new generation, which is the millennials and Generation Z that are coming. Well, I'm a millennial, doesn't matter, we're old. Generation Z, which is coming, which is thinking and working in a completely different way. They're the first generation that they're fully digital, I mean, in the digital mindset from the very beginning. And also, how do you manage this generational difference, yeah, of people who, many executives actually, and I don't have a slide for that, unfortunately, they say, you know, the newer generations that they don't want to, they want to work more flexibly. They raise more voice. They impose more rules. Actually, I think it's probably the biggest opportunity and moment in time where you can actually fix how you use technology and how you fix labor rights and how you fix how people balance work and life, because the new generation that comes is more vocal and more, let's say, stringent in how they want to work and how they want to, yeah?
Henry, you were the first talker, so I'll wrap up with you before opening the floor for questions. Out of the people in the panel, factually, you've seen more changes in the society. How do we tackle this? How do we learn to talk about the huge differences between generations in terms of wishes, in terms of the way we acknowledge society, the way we understand society, the way we understand doing business and tackling that?
I'm not sure exactly how we do it. I do think that it has to come from a background of seeing people as equals, as fully human beings, that's actually not the historical normal path, that ruler and ruled has been the historical path of human societies for thousands of years. And with the liberal democratic revolution, we started to see people in a political sense as fully equal, not simply in a spiritual sense. And that's what we tend to be tending to lose in focusing on people solely as productive entities. Then we see people as less productive, as less equal, as less human. You know, the thing as in the United States, I'm always cognizant of is that even today, 2/3 of Americans will not get a college degree. That fast-growing occupations are the sorts of occupations that people like us like to spend money on because we have enough money to purchase the goods we want, so now we want experiences. So we have massive growth in restaurant employment. Well, that's low-paid employment. Massive growth in tourism employment or some sort of hospitality employment. Well, that's low-level employment. And if we're not cognizant of that world, the world where people don't WhatsApp and email because what they're doing is cleaning your office or driving a truck across country with the gasoline that's going to fuel your car, or they're the people who are making your reservation online but aren't in management at the hotel you're going to stay at. Thinking about, they're the people who are increasingly displaced or upset. And if we're not thinking of them, they will, through the political process, make us think of them, and that probably won't be in a way that's conducive to aggregate growth.
You mentioned people being equal amongst themselves, but we have an extra actor. How equal are we to the first thing on Florian's slides, AI? Is AI a tool? Is it a serf, because you haven't used the term? Is it, you know, a slave for humankind, or is it the new leadership?
I think those are the choices that we get to make, in the sense that one can imagine AI because it can, you know, in the dystopian future where we have thinking machines who have no sense of dignity, you can actually have serfs who never complain. Is that a society we're willing to permit? Because if we are, then that's going to mean we have to treat the humans who used to do those things differently. On the other hand, if we maintain that we can create tools or machines, but they cannot displace the basic human dignity regardless of your productive output, then we can use AI as a wonderful tool. It's really a question of how we see each other as opposed to how we see our relation to the tool or the machine we create.
And the final question, it's sort of a yes or no, it's a brief one for the entire panel, is who's we? Because we kept on talking throughout this 45 minutes about we should do that, we should act, we should. Is it we as citizens? And Henry mentioned we shouldn't allow such a society. Who's that? Is it we as citizens, we as companies, we as governments? Who's the we?
I mean, so I would say that companies and governments are made up of citizens. So I'm going to go with the first. We as a society, with all its component parts.
That's what I would say. We have a tendency, and again, in the classes we run in, to think of ourselves in a private capacity, but actually our most important capacity is a public capacity. And how we act as citizens, I think, is the most important component of all to determining whether we have a dystopian or a optimistic future.
Well, government represents the citizens, right?
In an ideal world.
Yeah, it should. And then citizens should do something if it doesn't. But I would add on the businesses, because what was fundamentally different in business versus state is a democracy, yeah, ideally. But the businesses are not. I mean, it doesn't. In a company, you don't get to decide as a collective employees gathering what the company does, and then the executives need to be aware of those challenges and also opportunities to help more in tackling these societal changes and challenges and support societies more. Yeah? So, and you have seen, it was just signed a couple of months ago, a memorandum of understanding, or what the name is, an understanding by CEOs in US, that their role should be not only shareholder profit, but also stakeholder benefits, of stakeholder in the sense of the societies and the environment and so on, that they should put more focus on that.
Some would say that they discovered normality. But that's, just a very critical point of view. See, exercising the critical thinking, which I also ask you to do. We have about 15 minutes for questions, and we already have one question from His Excellency.
Good afternoon, panelists. Very interesting. And it raises big questions more than giving answers. Technology. You say that we, the citizens, the society, are deciding whether to go in technology or how its path should be. Or is technology the one who is deciding where we are going? Technology is now used by politicians to know what is the preferences of the people, and they tailor their programs and their talks to what would be accepted by the people, whether implemented or not. It depends on where you are. So technology will never stop. It didn't take the permission of the people to develop, whether it developed through governments, capable governments, or through companies. This was not a choice of the people. The people were just the consumers, whether they understand in this technology or not. My question would be to any of you, the future of technology in shaping politicians, that they have to take at the end the decisions that will affect the people and sometimes affecting the companies. Because the companies, when they developed the technology, they didn't share that with the politicians. We have seen that without naming in very big technological companies, in their campaigns, in their elections, how they even got the gods of technology to be under trial, how they would leak or manipulate the citizens and the users without reaching really consensus, without having these regulations of privacy to protect the normal citizen. I don't see that the normal citizen is a doer. He's just going in a big machine. You change the phone from iPhone 6, which I still have, to iPhone 11, which my daughter was standing in rows to get it in the first edition. We all stand in the rows waiting for technology. We don't manipulate it, it manipulates us. What is the future is with technology and our political life, our political decisions. Thank you.
Henry, shall we take?
I don't think that we're going to have the sort of society that regulates or requires, permission society that requires advance, approval to develop technologies, in part because societies that have that demonstrate their inability to create wealth quickly enough to satisfy people. But we see plenty of examples in history of dysfunctional political regimes that resist and create halfway houses of adoption of technology or diffusion of technology. Is that in a week we're going to have an election in Argentina, and I think you could say that Argentina is going through its 9th decade of political instability over how to react to the Industrial Revolution. Mm-hmm. That's the future I worry about, is a future that does not accommodate the need for change with the need for stability, is one that is continually debating in a way that makes life worse for those people. And then other countries do that. And when I look at the global situation, I would rather have Western democracy adapt and be the technological leader than the techno-totalitarian Chinese who deal with it in rather different ways and could easily become the country that spreads its vision of how to balance stability and technological growth, but one that just happens to leave out the little issue of liberty and human dignity.
Which may or may not be interested. But my question, building on His Excellency's question, is, will we have, as we have diplomats representing the interests of a country, will we have diplomats representing the interests of technology?
I mean, we already have essentially corporate diplomacy, and I actually think that's a positive thing. I think it's great. We have massive corporations in this world, and they are engaging on some of the biggest issues of our day. They are showing up at the UN. They are becoming partners in creating solutions. So, I mean, we talk about technology as this abstract thing, but we still always have an active verb assigned to a human being, or an institution that is peopled by human beings. So, I mean, I don't think anyone's representing technology in the abstract, but they are representing options and innovations.
Any other questions? Just a sec for the mic, because of the recording, the AI needs to learn from us as well.
Hello. Is this thing about the rate of change in technology is actually increasing, so it's an accelerating thing. So do you know what's the time gap between the first and second and third revolution? And if maybe by the time we finish this debate, hopefully not today, but in general about what we do the fourth, maybe we get in the fifth revolution and we are left behind. Thank you.
So, are we always running after some revolution?
I don't think we are always running after some revolution. I think it actually goes, you see, if you look at the industrial revolutions we've discussed here, we put names on them, right, and act as if they're these discrete moments in history. They're not, but there is a rapid moment of change, and that's why we're able to segment them, even though the activity that built them extends out in both directions.
Mm-hmm. You have a slide.
Of course he does.
It's good to have consultants on panels. They have slides for everything.
So, I mean, look at the timing of the four industrial revolutions. You had the first one at the end of the 18th century, and then you had 100 years to the second industrial revolution, yeah? And it's actually, it wasn't Ford, the first industrial production line, it was chickens in Cincinnati. And then you had 70 years to the third industrial revolution with the PLC in the 70s. And now we have 40 years to this industrial revolution that we call it industrial revolution, but it actually started 40 years ago, and it will continue because this industrial revolution, unlike the previous ones, is comprising of more different types of technologies and fields of science. I include, for example, in the Industry 4.0, behavioral sciences, because you need to understand behavioral and cognitive abilities of people to know what to avoid in AIs, not to replicate biases and so on. So the fifth industrial revolution, when it's going to happen, if you make a predictive model, probably 20 years. But I think it won't make any sense from now on to discuss about another industrial revolution. It's going to be a continuous advancement of technology and different types of sciences, a bit more continuously.
Any other questions? We have time for one more. No? I have a question for the audience. Do you leave this panel optimistic about the future and technology or pessimistic? Let's vote. Who's optimistic? Okay, I don't see unanimous. Who leaves pessimistic? Some very timid heads raised.
Can we add, did they change their view from when they came in?
Sure, of course we can. Who changed their view? We have one. Change from what? From pessimistic to optimistic? Or the other way around?
No, from optimistic to neutral, yes.
Can we help with moving into pessimistic? That being said, I'm glad that we leave with this panel and this discussion with a feeling of optimism and with the feeling that we still have the power to choose how we shape this. Of course, there are forces which may change this, but at least if we still hold the hope that we have the power, we have the power. It's in our minds to a certain extent. That being said, I live optimistic. I would like to thank all of you for a conversation that was highly lively, not according to plan, but we're not robots yet. Please join me into giving a hand for a wonderful panel.